Bill Dudley, coming out of retirement to make headlines once again, the former New York Fed president calling on the FOMC to reject further rate cuts that could theoretically help President Trump's reelection and his trade wars. Dudley wrote in Bloomberg Opinion, central bank officials face a choice: enable the Trump administration to continue down a disastrous path of trade war escalation, or send a clear signal that if the administration does so, the president, not the Fed, will bear the risks, including the risk of losing the next election. The column has drawn swift condemnation from across the spectrum and from the central bank itself. Fed spokeswoman Karl Smith saying the Federal Reserve's policy decisions are guided solely by its congressional mandate to maintain price stability and maximum employment. Political considerations play absolutely no role. So here to discuss is Bloomberg Opinion columnist Karl Smith in Washington, D.C., and Skanda Amarnath, Director of Research and Analysis at Employ America in New York. Karl, I want to start with you. What was your first reaction when you read the Dudley op-ed?
Shock, I guess. It was a little bit unbelievable. He went so far. At the end, of course, he said that perhaps they should try to get rid of Trump because Trump just has bad policies. It was unbelievable. I think it basically fed all the worst conspiracy fears of Trump supporters. It was in many ways even worse than the things that Trump has suggested himself. So I was pretty taken aback.
Skanda, was there anything redeeming from this?
Not really.
I
don't think this. I actually think even obviously the last paragraph was especially sort of felt partisan, but even the whole piece itself in terms of the scope for the Fed and the scope of macroeconomic policy, the idea that the Fed should be this backdoor trade policymaker is absolutely absurd. Maybe it was. I'm not here to judge the intentions, but it's a bad look. It's very ineffective. I think it's counterproductive to what the Fed's actually trying to achieve.
How, Karl, would the Fed even go about doing such as making clear that they aren't cutting for a specific reason, like they don't want to incite further trade tensions, they don't want to incite further moves from the president? Is it even possible to nuance it in that way?
Look, they could just say that much, what Dudley said, and I think that sort of message would get out there. Would it work? Almost certainly not, right? So, even if they were trying to be subtle about it, it's hard to imagine that the president would back off. But certainly if they challenge the president, there's nothing about Trump that says that he's going to back down, that he's, not just aching for a fight. So they could say it, they could be clear about it, but I think it's equally clear that it would completely backfire.
Skanda, let's go back to your point that even sort of the top of the piece, in which he said essentially that the Fed should not be bailing out or underwriting Trump's trade war and should say, this is not something that we're going to facilitate. Talk to us about why that, even if you forget the reelection part, is, in your view, deeply problematic.
Well, it's sort of mission creep, Fed overreach is really the problem there, right? That the Fed is not tasked with trade policy. We do not put the trade policy tools in the Federal Reserve. That's the job of Treasury, Robert Lighthizer, Steve Mnuchin. And to be fair, the president ran on a certain trade agenda. He's not really drifted away from what he said. The idea that the Fed should step in to sort of discipline what the U.S. trade policymakers are actually doing at this stage is, again, mission creep. The point of the Fed is to read and react. If they have to lower rates because that sort of softens the growth outlook, then so be it. It's sort of a net sort of that just net even. It's not a net benefit or a net cost. I don't see why this is a bailout itself.
Right. For the sake of argument, just to take the other side here, because it's a little bit of a pile-on at this point. What about the argument that actually, if you take a look at what the Fed is doing, that is political in that it is supporting President Trump and it is supporting his ability, Karl, to continue to take a very hard line by exactly what Bill Dudley was saying, by basically creating a put underneath President Trump and the economy and frankly, markets. What would you say to that?
Well, it's essentially their job, right? Their job is to support maximum employment no matter what the political policy is. And we have clear analogs of this. So oil price spikes are really similar to trade wars in they have a sort of both demand side effect and a supply side effect. And Dudley was saying, look, we have this horrible supply side effect that we can't counteract. But after decades of central banking, the consensus is that the central bank should not worsen oil price shocks, right? They should attempt to have the economy, look through them, as we say, sort of like coast through, accept a little bit of a price increase so that you won't get spikes in unemployment. So they'd be treating like the trade war the exact same way they'd be treating a real war, the exact same way they'd be treating Middle East policy. So that's not a political choice. That's a choice that's been mandated to them by Congress.
Skanda, why do you think Bill Dudley did this?
I'm struggling to see the motivation because I see a lot of counterproductive, like in the sense that I don't think the Fed is as political as Bill Dudley seems to make it out to be, because Jay Powell and Rich Clarida have been more disciplined, and I think they sincerely believe that the trade war could have some long-run benefits, it could have some long-run costs, it could have some short-run benefits, but it seems to be that the short-run costs are pretty obvious. And they've simply framed it as, we'll take the developments as we see them and we'll react to them. What Bill Dudley is saying gives a very different impression and actually undoes some of the sort of communication that I think has been pretty solid from Jay Powell in that respect.
Yeah, Karl, you said that essentially what Dudley suggests the Fed do is worse than any conspiracy theory that Trump himself has fanned. And I'm curious, from a very practical standpoint, how much has Bill Dudley made the lives of his former colleagues worse today than it was yesterday?
Well, I think, on the surface, you have to see that it's made it incredibly difficult. So I hopefully have a column coming out about that tomorrow. I think Powell has to react to this. I don't think the statement that they put out today was enough. He's got to say not only is a sort of Democratic overreach inappropriate, but this entire philosophy is bad. I mean, I think on Twitter I said, you could imagine, just in a fantasy of a silver lining, is that this could sort of turn around the argument about Fed independence. So far, people have been worried that if the Fed cuts, it will look like it's caving to Trump. Well, now, I mean, if the Fed doesn't cut, it looks like it's attempting to undermine Trump. So maybe they have a little bit of extra room if they could play it just perfectly, but obviously it's going to make their lives a nightmare, in the short term.
Honestly, I think that my bigger takeaway is just how political the Fed has become, even if it's not trying to, because it's being viewed in such a political lens no matter what it does. And the fact that that is sort of the narrative right now really, I think, was what Bill Dudley was trying to speak to, is that it's political regardless. I think that what he did, I think roundly everybody seems to agree, perhaps did not help, but it probably hurt the Fed maintain some independence. But nonetheless, I think that that's sort of the highlight here.
I just want to point out Bloomberg Opinion put a roundup column of all the people, like other people's takes. There were no Dudley defenders in the piece, so it's pretty.
I have to say, though, the issue of central banks becoming politicized is something that I know well from the United Kingdom as well, because central bank was drawn into the Brexit debate to a certain extent. The fact that they were highlighting economic issues and concerns about Brexit made them a target as well. It's really hard to be a central banker right now. Woe is them. Bloomberg Opinion columnist Karl Smith and Skanda Amarnath, we thank you so much. He's, of course, from Employ America.